welcome to the program. Fulton Armstrong is here to discuss geopolitics and other issues in Latin America. He is currently a senior fellow at America University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. He followed Latin American affairs for almost 30 years in a number of U.S. government positions. From 2008 to 2011, he served as a senior professional staff member responsible for Latin America on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to this, Armstrong served at the United States Interests Section in Havana and subsequently as senior analyst at the CIA. He served 2 terms as the Director for Inter-American Affairs at the National Security Council from 1995 to 97, and again from 1998 to 1999. Between those 2 stints, he was Deputy NIO for Latin America. Fulton's areas of expertise are in international relations, intelligence, and U.S. policy processes. And in addition to his senior fellowship at America University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, he is also an adjunct professor at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Washington, D.C. for Syracuse University. We couldn't have asked for a better guest to come on to discuss all things in Latin American geopolitics as well as economics, and we cover on some other issues as well. The conversation was so wide-ranging and so in-depth, we felt it was important to break it into 2 parts. So this episode features part 1 of my interview with Fulton Armstrong, where we focus mostly on one of the hot topics around the world and in North America, which is migration, both legal and illegal migration among nations, between nations, and really the dislocation of populations across Latin America. We talk about some of the root causes of that go back many, many years. We talk about some of the potential policy prescriptions within and beyond Latin America. And we also spend some time discussing some of the challenges, the unique challenges with addressing this in specific countries. For instance, the difference between how an El Salvador may address this versus how Mexico, and the different dynamics given the sizes of the country, given the histories of the country, given the complexities of local versus national government. It's a fascinating discussion. If you're interested in the topic of migration in the Western Hemisphere in general, if you're interested in policy prescriptions, if you're just interested in the origins of this challenge, whether you live in the Western Hemisphere or not, I think we do a really good job in this first part of going through that conversation. Now, part 2, which will be our next episode, we discuss more of the foreign policy writ large of Latin American nations and their interaction with the world beyond the Western Hemisphere. And we felt that was important to separate to a second interview because while it's related to some of the economic and geopolitical challenges that are unique to the Western Hemisphere, we thought it was important to give it its own space. And I have some thoughts on that are separate from the issues that we talk about here with migration. So part 1 is this episode. Stick around. Fulton spends about a half hour with us, a little bit more, talking through and chewing through some of the challenges specific to the Western Hemisphere, migration, economic issues, and interactions with the United States. And then I hope you'll stick with us, and I hope you subscribe to this program so that you can get the next episode when it drops, which will be my conversation with Fulton Part 2, where we discuss the larger geopolitical environment that all Latin American countries are within. Stick around at the end of this program. I'll give you some quick thoughts based on my conversation with Fulton. But for right now, I present part 1 of my interview, my conversation on Latin American geopolitics with Fulton Armstrong. Fulton, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here.
All right, so I've given an introduction to the audience about your bio and a little bit about your professional history, but would love for you to give a quick introduction yourself to our audience.
Well, as you presumably have said, I'm an adjunct professor right now at 2 universities, American University here in Washington, D.C., but also Syracuse University has a really wonderful program here in Washington where I teach undergraduate students, juniors and seniors, on how U.S. foreign policy is made or not made, and work with them on understanding and navigating U.S. foreign policy making here in Washington. I have a lot of fun doing that. I also teach in other places for shorter periods of time over the course of the year. I do some writing, do some analysis, do some troublemaking wherever I possibly can.
And it makes you the perfect guest for this program and the perfect person for our audience to hear from. So, internationally, for better or worse, are this part of the world, the U.S. and Latin America, is associated with migration, largely because of political trends in the United States, but other factors have influenced that as well. But we always hear about it really from the U.S. perspective. You are uniquely positioned to give us a perspective from Latin American countries about the origins of some of this issue and then the challenges that are being caused within Latin America. There's this assumption that all, migrants are all headed just to the US. Well, there's a lot of that, but there's a lot of dislocation within Latin America. So talk to us a little bit about the origins of the current migration challenges in the region, and where you see countries that are handling this well, and those that you think have a lot of room for improvement.
Hmm. The list of countries handling it well would be a little bit on the short side, but let's start with the bigger question, which is a little bit unfortunate that, and I don't fault you for starting with the migration question. It is the headline question, at least from the US. And I think Western Europeans are watching us quite closely, and even Australians and others are watching us quite closely. How are we going to be dealing with this? Because all of us are dealing with migration issues in one way or another. Migration is not a new issue. Internal migration is not a new issue either. Here in the United States, we've had it in the past, and we're probably going to be experiencing it some with what's happening in our own economy, with climate change and other dynamics. But you're completely right that we've seen this great surge over the last 15 or 20 years in northbound migration from Latin America. I would also say that others have found that that's sort of our soft underbelly because many hundreds of thousands of Asian migrants have also come in through our southern border, as well as non Latin American, or let's say non Spanish speaking migrants have also come in through there, including many Haitians. Many other Caribbeans have been coming in through our border as well. These issues did not begin overnight. They have deep roots, and there is a big political dynamic to it here in the United States that, in gross terms, breaks down into looking at it as being predominantly driven by what we would call pull factors, the perception in the hemisphere south of the border that our doors are open and that people can come up. There are people even who say we have no borders, and that people can come up, and that family members, relatives, or even American civil society, churches, and others will help them get jobs and settle and sort of sneak in and then prosper here in the United States because we have such a big economy, but also economy that needs them. We really and truly need their labor. They're taking jobs that most Americans, most native born Americans of all races don't want to do anymore and stuff. And so the pull factors are what many people focus their policy debates on. And that is because we are a big country, we can absorb them and they can get in because we have a big border, particularly the southern border and the northern border. But they're not coming from the northern border, they're coming from the southern border. So that's one factor. But there are another group of people that analytically focus on what we call the push factors. The push factors. And in political terms, they aligned with the pull factor people, being generally speaking Republicans in the United States, and the push factor people being predominantly Democrats. The answer to the pull factor people is to build wars and build walls and put troops on the border and do things to basically say that we're closed for business. Don't even try to come up. And the push factor people saying, no, we need to try to find what are the problems in the region that are making people want to come up to the United States to leave their country. These are often people without very advanced education. And even if they have good education, to the idea of leaving their home country to come to a place where they don't speak the language, they don't have a foundation, they don't know how our country works, is really very scary. So there's got to be a really strong drivers. These push factors have to be very strong. And they generally fall into areas such as violence. There's a high level of violence in many of these societies. We're talking about mostly Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, where violence is down, but there are other potential clocks ticking, time bombs ticking in El Salvador, Nicaragua to an extent, and of course down south of the border where you have even more, like in the case of Venezuela, you have a real tempest brewing down there. So violence is one, weak institutions because the schools, the medical system, etc. But there's also a silent factor that many Americans are not aware of, and many of your other listeners probably are not aware of, and that is climate change. This region used to be able to look at your clock and say it's 2 o'clock, the rains are going to come, and the farmers didn't have to build irrigation. There was no need. There was no need for water, extensive water management. Now they're either having floods, massive floods, that are washing away the topsoil and destroying their crops, or they're having periods of drought, which are leaving them then without an ability to feed themselves, without crops to sell in the marketplace, etc. And they have no way of living. And so they're moving off. So when you take things like violence, you take no health care, no schools, no nothing. You take the fact that many parts of these societies in rural areas, but also in urban areas, now the gangs, because of government weakness, the gangs are the primary source of governance, and the gangs are taking their children and recruiting them, and through coercion primarily, not enticement and stuff. These people say, forget it, I'm going to the north. I don't speak English, I don't have job prospects, I don't have relatives, but I'm still going to do it. And I'm going to do something even scarier. I'm going to send my children up first. This is a huge shock to people who are very family oriented, have deep roots in their country, who love their cultures, who are very, very, in this case, Central American or South American. So it's a deep crisis that we have to deal with them. Is anybody doing it well? One could say that in El Salvador, which was never the major exporter of migrants, that President Bukele is at least addressing some of the major drivers. He's addressing the violence driver because the gangs, which are actually U.S. export, the gangs are called maras in Central America, in El Salvador. They were actually born and originally formed in Los Angeles jails, where they were rounded up as illegal migrants. They were called illegal, undocumented migrants. They were put in the jails, in the prisons, and we deported them. But the gangs that they formed in the prisons then became their only way of sustenance and communication in El Salvador. And they said, hey, this is a weak, corrupt government. Let's us keep our little networks going. And the criminality then became expanded rapidly, and they took over entire parts of cities, neighborhoods, and in some cases, entire towns. Bukele came in, Bukele having been a man previously of the center left, affiliated primarily with the FMLN party, which had been discredited by its own corruption, as the right had been discredited, the Arena right had been discredited. And he said, I'm the third alternative. Vote for me and I'll throw the gangs in jail. And he certainly has. I forget the more recent figures, but we're talking about, I think, 50, 60,000 people put into jail, sometimes without what we might consider due process. But even though there wasn't due process, the niceties of democracy and the niceties of due process don't matter to a lot of people if the streets suddenly become safe. And migration from El Salvador has gone down. Is that the way we want the Central Americans to deal with migration? I'm not sure.
So there's a couple of root causes there that I'd like to dig into a little bit. Let's start with the gang issue. So you explained pretty well the origins of this actually being in U.S. prisons. A topic that has been a topic of conversation in the U.S. about these are supposed to be correctional facilities, and yet by and large they are producing a more professional version of criminal than what went in to begin with. Now, when you look at that over the last, let's just say 30 years, is there a pipeline in your view of new gang members, gang leaders coming out of that same system that created the original? Is that part of the challenge in Central America now that as U.S. authorities continue to detain and hold migrants or others for that matter, and then deport them to their country of origin, that they're actually just feeding the problem?
That's a good question for which I don't have the data to substantiate my answer. But my hunch is that the problem of deporting these people has been significantly reduced. And in part because at least we now notify them of what we know about the deportees. For years, I mean for years, plural, we were deporting these people without telling the Salvadorans what we knew about them. And it was very frustrating for the Salvadorans who didn't have even serious liaison at the civil police level, police to police level, who these people coming off the airplanes were. I think now we do have a much better flow of information who they are. I think also the awareness, like this is just, I think, because I really don't focus on the domestic side of this. I think also we're more aware of the dangers of letting these people form such extensive networks of gangs in the prisons, and I think also more of the stopping these people from entering U.S. society is done border rather than after they're deeply in the cities and can network themselves. But that's just my speculation. There's another component to the whole gang phenomenon that I didn't mention initially, and that is the drug trade, which is another big failure that I think that all of us, including our European friends, should focus on. The United States government spent easily 12 billion, and because of the fungibility of a lot of government programs, it could be a number of billions more. But on so-called Plan Colombia, we spent at least an explicitly designated $12 billion on Plan Colombia to stem the flow of drugs from Colombia to the United States. It, of course, was an utter failure at the end, and in part because the Colombians, under previous governments, this government is much, I think, much more balanced in its approach. Previous governments were actually channeling the money more toward their counterinsurgency rather than to the counter narcotics thing. But uh, they were spraying large parts of the countryside. They were doing all kinds of military style operations to try to interdict. But the flow of drugs continued, the flow of cocaine continued. And even with the fentanyl crisis basically nudging out other forms of narcotics in the United States, the flow of cocaine here is still monumental, a big failure. But the failure of that policy has also been a failure for what we call the transit countries, including Central America, particularly the northern part of the northern tier, which is Honduras and Guatemala, where the narcos determined how easily they could hop, skip, and jump up to Mexico and then into the United States. For doing that, they had to get some local hires there to help them with security and moving things, and that was also a way of fomenting the maras and drug and the gang culture. The maras learned then how to imitate the gangs that were working with the narcos so that the local police would be as afraid of them as they were of the narcos. So we basically fomented this culture of audacity, this culture of intimidation in Central America that made them look a lot more formidable than they really were.
That's fascinating. So, is there any particular country along that path into the U.S. that has been more affected by that than others? We hear about gang violence in Mexico frequently, but I know that that happens in countries well further down the line than just Mexico. Can you give us a sense of where the local law enforcements have really just disintegrated? And if you think that there is any specific policy that can prop them up, because it feels like successive governments in these countries have tried, with the exception of El Salvador recently, most of those efforts, it does not seem have had lasting impacts. So it's a two-part question. One, the places that are most affected by the violence that you're talking about and the organizational culture you're talking about, and then two, places where there have been policies to counter it that are effective.
The places where the level of violence has been greatest, we're talking about here local gangs, and we're talking about narcos and stuff. The local gangs, the violence was highest in El Salvador, where there were entire towns, there were entire districts of towns that were redlined. That if you lived in those districts, a taxi wouldn't take you into those districts. If you lived in that district, you couldn't get a job. You'd come out of that district and try to get a job outside that district, and they would see where you lived and they say, no, no, thank you, we don't want someone from your district. It was redlining here in the United States, and I imagine in Western Europe as well. The concept of redlining would be based on racial sort of factors. Here in Central America, it's based on socioeconomic, but also crime. Are the gangs, do you live in an area where the gangs are active, which means are you particularly safe, but also are you subject to extortion by gangs, where a gang person would grab you or grab your brother, because unfortunately males are victims, and then therefore basically extort you to do extortion against the company that you're working for. And so those areas then become more and more victims of the maras. And so in those cases, probably one could, I think, demonstrate with pretty serious data that El Salvador was the worst. And in that way, Bukele was responding to the most serious of problems. Honduras suffered also from pretty significant violence, as did Guatemala, but it was basically sectoral. It was small. It was small stuff compared to the more systematic stuff. But Mexico, as a country, has suffered more deaths, more warfare, more deterioration, more fear, more panic than any other country. And ironic, unlike in the case of Salvador, which is a little teeny country. Okay, let's face it, Salvador is small. Mexico is a massive country of 130, 140 million people. A lot of people outside Mexico don't know this is a real country. This isn't some little banana republic, and it's really complex with serious regional dynamics, etc. The irony in Mexico is that if the government were to ever try a Bukele type crackdown, the surge in violence would be astronomical. When governments like President Calderon have tried it, President Calderon being the one that tried the toughest, the hard hand, the mano dura type of policy in Mexico, the number of assassinations in the street and murders surged incredibly. And whenever the government does it, the violence increases. When we do our little activities, like you will know, as your listeners will know, that there recently was a rather spectacular, probably a movie will be made about it, where the son of El Chapo, one of the famous narcos that we finally caught after he escaped from Mexican prison several times, El Chapo is sitting, I think, he was tried up in New York. I don't know where he's sitting in prison, but he's finally under lock and key. But he has his sons, Los Chapitos. And one of the Chapitos has betrayed El Mayo, who was the great partner of El Chapo in running the Sinaloa cartel. And the story, at least, that apparently DEA sources are putting out, because they're all anonymous, is that one of the Chapitos persuaded El Mayo to get on an airplane unarmed, a little bit weird, unarmed, and flew him, thinking that he was going into northern Mexico to look at real estate, flew him into Texas, El Paso, where he was handed over to DEA agents and is now under arrest. That's what we call part of the kingpin strategy, where you basically try to get the kingpins, you get the big bosses of the cartels. It's really good politically. It makes it look like we're taking down the kingpins. We're really going to deal the lethal blow to the leadership of the cartels. But I would say my experience, having watched the so-called war on drugs for as many years as it's existed, which is 50 years, it's a little bit of a political game. It serves our policymakers more than it really serves the war on drugs, because these are networks which are sometimes much more decentralized, usually much more decentralized than we care to admit. And behind the capos, there are little capitos, and those guys will grow into the job. There will be a surge in violence among the lieutenants, a surge in violence, but there will not be a decline in the production and movement of narcotics into the United States. So it looks good, a little notch in the pistol of our political class, of our law enforcement people and our political people, but it doesn't really do anything. But it will lead to a surge in violence as they mobilize their troops and gangs get in the way, people will die. And that sense of violence, where sometimes it's absolutely brutal, where they'll take, and it's not really the numbers that you need to look at, it's the sense of terror in society that they project. Where I remember, it was some years ago, where they killed These are all foot soldiers of the cartels. They would line them up, shoot them in the head, and then hang their bodies over pedestrian bridges, over main roadways in a city. That sort of terror has a real impact and completely undermines the credibility of local government. And so, what's the solution for that? What are you going to do? The more you crack down, the more arrests you do, the more you're going to then bring about violence among them and a sense of terror among the society.
So let me go back quickly to the migrant issue. Then I'm going to come back to trying to address some of the violence and the networks of criminality. Um, which countries across Latin America are dealing with the largest population of dislocated people? Because again, we focus very much on the U.S. and how many have made it to the United States. But I have read recently that I think, you correct me if I'm wrong here, I think Colombia has the largest number of people living in the country who are not who are migrants, who are dislocated from their home location. Uh, but give us a sense of how those governments are handling these large numbers of population movements from places like El Salvador in the recent past and now from Venezuela and from other places.
I don't know the numbers. Uh, they probably could, numbers probably could be found, but the reliability of numbers is always questionable. So you would have to go and find an array of different numbers and then analyze them closely to figure it out. But I think one could say with a pretty high level of confidence that Colombia has the greatest number of dislocated persons for several reasons. One, its own civil war, which ended only a few years ago. It ended a few years ago where there were huge internal dislocations because of the war, the so called war on drugs, but also the war between the FARC guerrillas, the ELN guerrillas, and the government, as well as some pretty serious systematic human rights violations by all parties, including the government, and the incomplete national reconciliation process from that. So those are, you could call them long-term internal dislocations. We're probably talking about millions of people. I don't know the numbers. There are people, serious people here in Washington, D.C., who could probably get us those numbers. But then you have dislocations primarily from Venezuela. In Venezuela, but there are two kinds of Venezuelans, and the numbers are very difficult to ascertain. For political purposes and for dramatic purposes, not that journalists would ever write for drama, but for dramatic purposes, the original, which I think was 32 million Venezuelans, if you were to believe all of the press reports, the country would be half empty by now. But there were originally 5 or 6 million people that we counted as Venezuelans who were actually Colombians. Colombians who, since the 1940s and 50s, for economic purposes and security purposes, because of the wars, because the Colombian Civil War was a very long running civil war and a very bloody one, they had migrated over to Colombia, and they'd been there so long that we really they migrated over to Venezuela. They've been there so long that we counted them Venezuelans. So the first waves of people leaving Venezuela during the Venezuela crisis, which has been going on for a long time and stuff, probably really were Colombians going back to their roots and stuff. How many of them were Colombians? How many of them were? And since then, how many real, true Venezuelans have gone? We don't know. How many of them stayed and how many of them went on down into Ecuador and Peru and Chile? I was down in Chile a couple of years ago, and who's out there on the street but a whole bunch of Venezuelans, and Peru, a whole bunch of Venezuelans. And so there is this migration away from the political violence, not political violence, the political tumult, because the violence really has been secondary in Venezuela, southbound and all of that. And of course, a lot of Venezuelans have become northbound as well. And the events of the last week will also be fueling a lot more Venezuelan out migration. In part, as I'm sure you know, migration is stimulated mostly by economics, mostly by perceptions of instability, perceptions of pain and real pain, the violence, but also perceptions of what's going to happen in the future. And the saber rattling that happens internally by the two sides, the opposition and by the government, but also when the US government huffs and puffs. When we do things, it stimulates a lot of migration. In the case of Cuba, for example, Cuba, if some numbers are to be believed, including numbers that the Cuban government appears to have validated, they've lost 10% of their population just during the Biden administration. And you've got to wonder why. The economy has surely suffered because of COVID, because of the Venezuelan tumult has reduced oil shipments to Cuba. It's also reduced Venezuela's ability to pay for Cuban doctors, teachers, etc., which was a legitimate business transaction between the two countries. But also, one reason that it really has gone up during Biden was after the Obama normalization with Cuba, Cuba began to prosper. There was a great growth of the private sector in Cuba. A lot of American visitors were going down there under people to people regulations, which was not just tourism, etc. But when Trump came in, he suspended it all. But the Cuban people are quite smart. They said, well, we can deal with Trump. Trump's going to go and stuff. And then when Biden was elected, their hopes said, good, we're going to go back to the Obama normalization. When Biden continued almost every single aspect of the Trump policies, the Cuban morale of the people, we're not talking just of the government, of the people, they said, oh, forget it. This is hopeless. This isn't a problem of just Republicans in the United States. This is a problem that the American people don't want to deal with us. They don't want us to stand up. And that became then the major psychological, in addition to the economic, the major psychological driver of migration. They said, this is hopeless. They said, the Yankees, which they call us, they don't call us gringos, the Yankees will never respect us, never deal with us, and that's it. And that's what's happening in Venezuela too. No matter what Venezuela does, they survived incredible economic sanctions by the United States. So they say, forget it, we're out of here. The Americans will never deal with us. We're out of here. So they go to Colombia and they go through. I'm sure everybody has read about the dangerous passage through the Darien Gap, the Darien Gorge, there, which is from Colombia into Panama. And Panama, you then get on the phone and you call a relative or a friend up in the US. They put you in touch with a snakehead who then smuggles you through Costa Rica or over Costa Rica into Mexico and then into the US.
So let's circle back now to the question of violence, and specifically let's talk about the cartels from a drug perspective, but also those that are just gaining power because of, as you said, the weakening institutions throughout Latin America. So in Mexico, you had highlighted that, look, just having a stronger central government that tries to crack down doesn't work because it creates an enormous episode of violence. El Salvador has had a version of that, but because they're smaller, they've been able to make some of that work, but we don't know what that looks like long term. And you alluded to some time bombs, which I'd love to know what some of those are. And then in other places, you've got, like Colombia, the alleviation of a civil war, so that level of violence has come down, but you still have issues with local drug lords. You still have fiefdoms and some relics of that civil conflict. So from a policy perspective, what can these countries do realistically that have relatively weak institutions to start building them up to the point that the countries themselves and the societies won't tolerate the criminality? And do you have a good example of any Latin American country in the last 20 or 30 years that has accomplished that sort of turnaround?
That's an excellent question. There are some countries, they tend to be the smaller ones like Uruguay, that have managed some of these problems pretty well. Uruguay, I think, is 4 million people, blessed with some pretty good agriculture and pretty good beef and a pretty good location with strong markets over in Argentina and up in Brazil. It's not a horrible neighborhood to be in, but it's a difficult region. It's a difficult region because of tumult in Brazil. You will remember the Bolsonaro period, which was a huge challenge to their constitution, to their democracy, to their political culture. They have relatively strong institutions, but those institutions were thrown into disarray because of political disarray, because of corruption by predecessor administrations, corruption by the Bolsonaro administration. And I think Lula, the current president, who's a new and improved, if you will, version of the Lula that we saw before Bolsonaro and before his successor, Dilma, who was basically ushered out in what some people call a constitutional coup, but with some credible allegations of some questionable activities on her own. Brazil could punch above its weight if it could get its own act together, but it's such a big country. It's a very eclectic country. It's an inclusive country. It's more complex than many Americans and West Europeans see it as being. That if it could come together as Lula wants it to come together, and if it would play more of a regional role rather than a global role, it likes this global idea a whole lot. If it could do that, it could become a pole of a great deal of positive influence. Argentina is always has this cycle of getting on track, falling off track, getting on track, falling off track. It has institutions, but it falls off track. In the case of Chile, which had very strong institutions, but fell way off track for many years of dictatorship, was climbing back on track, but it's been trying to write a new constitution now for 3 or 4 years, and they've failed, in part because they haven't yet done that national reconciliation necessary from the past. And right now you have a government that is essentially lame duck, that doesn't have much of a mandate and is losing its momentum. In Peru, you also have a government riddled with all kinds of legitimacy issues and corruption issues. I'm going up now the west coast of it, and Ecuador also with repeated challenges and what one could call constitutional coups or corruption coups or whatever you could call them. And then you've got Colombia, which does have some pretty good institutions, but also a lot of unsettled issues from the past. Venezuela, which of course is always at the point. Panama, which is, so you don't really have yet a model that they can do. What could we do as the United States, or we do as foreigners? We could do some things. We could basically repeat to them, don't expect us to come in and rescue you. We could also try to rationalize a little bit our relationship with them, because right now, as we have always done with Latin America, we've always seen them as sort of our backyard. We're still stuck in the so-called Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, and we don't want anybody else to go into the backyard. Right now, we are seized with Chinese influence in Latin America. Well, the Chinese are going in and getting for a dime what if we were in the region we could get for a nickel. But because we've walked off the playing field, we don't really care about Latin America, and the Latin Americans know it. And so the Latin Americans keep looking and saying, well, the Americans going to help us? Well, the Chinese will help us and stuff. I guess I'm not being clear with you on this. I'm zigzagging, as does U.S. policy in Latin America. We're basically incoherent. We want them to be certain things. We want them to be inclusive. We want them to be democratic, but we aren't inclusive in the hemisphere. We try to divide them and we conquer them. We don't deal with all of them. We don't deal with them inside their countries appropriately. We want them to be like us, except when we don't want them to be like us, etc. We don't really understand the hemisphere, and we could do a lot better if we were to be coherent and lay out. We do have a problem, and that is our example in the past was very, very powerful. And we have become ourselves up here in the quality of our democracy, in the quality of our Congress, the quality of our courts, and the quality of our culture of accountability. We have become ourselves a little bit zigzaggy, and we have communicated to their presidents and to their Congresses and to their courts, hey, a little bit of politicization. Hey, the world's greatest democracy can do it. Why can't I? So we're giving these very contradictory messages to them. Don't do as I do as I say, except if you're my friend, I'll give you a pass. And which gets to the broader problem that we have right now, that we had a very coherent policy, even under the current administration, of saying we believe in a rules based international order. So let's obey the rules. Let's understand the international order. But I think it's pretty safe to say that most countries in Latin America are somewhat shocked by the violations of international order by a friend or two of the United States, and that the United States has not invoked those rules and not taken action against the violators of those rules. And they say, but wait a second, if it's a rules based international order, how come they don't apply to everybody? And in Latin America, also, they do believe that what you do to the least of my brothers, you do unto me. And when they see the way that we treat, even though we don't have to agree with Cuba, even if they don't agree with Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua, what we do to Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, they know could be done to them. And the relationship between Latin America and the United States improved massively during the period of Obama normalization with Cuba. Trump set it back, and Biden has not restored it. So there's a lot of things that we could be doing to bring coherence and stability, other than finger wagging at their behaviors and condemning the Chinese incursions into our backyard.
So, one last topic on some of the hemispheric issues before we take a more global foreign policy view from Latin America. And that is a lot of what we've just talked about over the last half hour doesn't paint a very positive picture about the future of institutions or stability in the region. And of course, climate change is not changing anytime soon for the positive. So, the one can take away from much of what we've talked about so far that in fact, the drivers of migration are only getting worse, root causes. This will likely result in more migration within and out of Latin American countries. Is that your view as an expert on the region that over the next, let's call it decade, that there is no reason to think that we will see any significant change in the factors that have led to much of the dislocation of populations that we have been experiencing now for the last several years?
Very fair question. I think significant is a soft word. I think we could see some significant changes. We could see some significant changes if the U.S. were to adopt a serious policy. It's the zigzagginess, if you forgive me overusing the word in this discussion, of our policy that has made it a little bit hard for people to figure out what's going on. People will rush to the border because they think that the door will close in the future, so I've got to go now. And we're not predictable. We have not had an immigration reform in a zillion years. I think the last one was during Reagan Bush was a thing. And if we did an immigration reform and we found a way to do it, that we would find the balance, at least on the pull factor side, that would that would help. On the push factors, we could improve quite significantly. And it was Kamala Harris's job. But I don't want to really beat her up for not having solved it, because the underlying drivers of these drivers of mass migration from the northern tier in Central America, you can't solve with just a couple of magical political potions. It takes a lot of work. And I'm not sure that the US bureaucracy gave her what she needed to do it, because they set her up with Mission Impossible when the Central American governments were corrupt to the core, and they had her dealing with people that were our partners. You had asked earlier about the militaries. Well, the militaries were corrupt. Our partners were corrupt. And how could she then go and do photo opportunities, which is what senior policymakers do, with these corrupt sort of people and expect to get pretty decent results? But we could do something that started to address the factors at home. We could tell the Central Americans that we understand their game and we're not going to let them play that game with us anymore. We could start putting strings on assistance. We could start demanding that our embassies reach out to all factors, all elements of those societies. We could start targeting our assistance to do certain things. We could even do something really, really radical and that is start publishing data that we have in our possession that shows the level of corruption of those governments, how much money they have in American banks, for example, and how much of how corrupt the elites in those countries are that they don't pay taxes. You can't build a country if people don't pay taxes. You can't do things if, for example, every dollar that goes into healthcare winds up going into some private person's pocket and stuff. So we could shine a little bit of light on the way these countries operate. Yes, some of our cute little buddies will have their feelings hurt, but it's the only way we could do it. And I think that we could do it. But we're just going to have to be a little bit tougher and do it. So we could do it. I think there's another dynamic in here, and that is the demographic dynamic. The demographics of the hemisphere are changing. The youth bulge that we were experiencing 15 years ago, this great big bulge of young people of under 25s, is going to be passing a little bit like the egg passing through the snake, is going to be passing. And within 10 years, I think the time frame you were asking was 10, 15 years, the number of such mobile people is probably going to be going down. So I think policy inside the US on how we're going to manage our migration policy towards Central America, and really doing something with appropriate conditionality and what's happening in the region, maybe a Bukele type thing, but with respect for human rights, with respect for democracy, with respect for due process, with respect for elections and stuff, might be a way to go. But it does require the United States to be a little bit tougher than we've been.
That's part one of my conversation with American University's Fulton Armstrong on Latin America. I want to pause here to give a couple of reflections and also preview our part two conversation, which will be in our next episode in this series. So, the biggest takeaway that I think we have to have from this is to pause and reflect where we are. Now, this is the point in time in the podcast where I have to remind you when and where I'm recording it because I don't know when you're going to hear it. So it's August of 2024. We are just past a very controversial election in Venezuela that, as of the recording of this podcast, the ruling government of Nicolas Maduro is claiming victory, but several countries in the region and the United States are disputing the outcome of that election, and it would appear any fair analysis would be that Maduro lost that election. It's also important to note as we go into August 2024, whenever you're listening to this program, that it is a time when we still have a lot of uncertainty around America's political future. We have a competitive presidential election, which will be decided in November. We don't know how that's going to go. The polls are still too close to give us a real indication. So, with all of those unknowns about where things are going to take us, let me stop for a moment to say two things about the topics we discussed. Number one, on the issue of migration and the economic challenges and the root causes of those. There are no simple fixes, right? That's obvious. If there was, there would have already been a policy prescription. But I asked the question of Fulton, and in some ways it was a little bit of a leading question because my implication in it was the factors that have caused migration are not going anywhere. Climate change that is affecting weather patterns that affects agricultural production in Latin America is not going anywhere anytime soon. These are long-term trends. They are not going to dramatically change or shift. Of course, weather patterns can change from year to year. There'll be good years, there'll be bad years, but the trajectory is that places that used to be easier to farm will not be. Places that didn't used to flood will. Places that didn't have issues with water management are going to. Those root causes aren't going anywhere. And even if institutions across Latin America do start to take a turn for the better, that's not a quick process. That takes years, it can take decades to rebuild institutions that have either atrophied or been intentionally weakened. So and let's face it, there's nothing in the drug policy of the international community that is likely to disrupt the economic incentives for criminal cartels to continue shipping the the fentanyl and cocaine and heroin and every other form of illegal narcotic, not only into the United States but around the world. So none of the underlying factors are likely to change all that much, no matter what the political outcomes in various countries are. But there are many things that could change to exacerbate the situation. We haven't seen a true global recession in years. We haven't seen the kind of hyperinflation that has gripped Argentina and Venezuela take effect in larger economies like a Brazil, for instance. We don't necessarily see that threat on the immediate horizon, but we know that economic mismanagement can happen quickly in countries with weak institutions where there may be a political incentive to print money. There may be a political incentive to try and do things that don't make a lot of economic sense but have short term benefit but long term consequences. And despite a lot of interesting characters coming to power throughout Latin America, there is no real sense that the region is coming any closer to the kind of regional solutions and the kind of regional alliances that could create a more stable economic region, zone that would allow the Europeans and Asian countries and the United States and others to interact in a more holistic way. There's a lot of individual countries that are going off in their own direction. All of that to say, whether you're listening to this in the United States or you're listening to it in one of the Latin American countries we've been talking about, or if you're listening from another part of the world, one of the things that you should take away from what we discussed today is the likelihood of the underlying root causes of the migration challenges that are vexing this region and the United States are not likely to change anytime soon, no matter who gets elected and no matter what the policies are. There may be short term abatement depending on different policy prescriptions, but the long term trajectory, unless something significantly changes in the region, is probably for more dislocation of people, more violence, weaker institutions, and greater challenges because climate change is not going anywhere. Unfortunately, the uh, the incentives for the drug market are only getting stronger, if anything, and we haven't really seen a significant economic hit that has caused underlying societal challenges to get worse. Unemployment is not great across Latin America, but it's not as bad as it has been. The likelihood of some sort of economic shock coming from any number of places, which could include global conflicts that spill over into other regions that are not directly affiliated with the conflict, but it disrupts oil markets, it disrupts agricultural markets, it disrupts the movement of trade across oceans. All of these things can have huge economic implications, cause significant unemployment, and then how countries with weak institutions respond to that is anybody's guess. So if we first acknowledge that it is not great in this part of the world for the underlying causes of dislocation of populations, and it's not likely to get a lot better in the short term, and we don't know what the economic outlook looks like, but we know there are probably some challenges on the horizon. The other thing that I want to highlight in this section of the conversation is also there's always an opportunity for something or someone to emerge in a situation like this where there are weaker institutions. And while we often are concerned with the rise of drug cartels, drug leaders, dictators, military authoritarians, and so forth, there's also the plausible and possible rise of benevolent leaders, those who are more potentially technocratic in nature, real problem solvers, those who can transcend the challenges and the issues and offer a vision. Now, I wouldn't bet on this necessarily, but what's interesting over the last number of years is we've had some elections that produced interesting characters all around Latin America, some of which are appealing to a more left leaning political audience, some that are more appealing to a right leaning political audience. But I have certainly noticed, as an American sitting in the United States and observing this, that Americans and others seem to be more interested in these leaders coming out of Latin America than they have in the past. We've always heard from the big countries of Europe, the big countries of Asia, the big economies of the world, and maybe we would hear something from Brazil or we'd hear something from a country like Colombia during key moments in time. but they weren't active players in the international community the way that you might expect a country of their size and scope and the challenges they have to be. But we're hearing more from them, and dynamic leaders, like them or not, from places like Argentina, places now like Mexico, places like Colombia, places like El Salvador, they're making their way around the world with ideas and with vision and with policies and with bold vision. And we don't know which one of those will ultimately take hold, but we do know that there seems to be more of a solutions oriented academic class, political class, legal class throughout Latin America that is less ideological than what we have seen historically. There's more of a push to just solve the problems and make life better for people and try different things until we get it right, and a willingness to go their own way, to not look to the United States to solve the problems, not look to Europeans or Asians to have economic solutions, but to look within and to find the innovative solutions in their own countries that might allow them to solve regional challenges to create a stronger union of states, even if it's a loose union, that makes it more powerful and punch above its weight class in the international community. So there is reason for hope. I say this all in summary to say that big challenges create big opportunities. And all the challenges we discussed in this episode, and they are very significant and they're causing real human suffering in this part of the world. And unfortunately, some of them are likely to get worse. But in those challenges come people with new ideas, come leaders who are willing to try some different things to make society better for their people, who are willing to look at different alliances in the region and around the world to improve the standing of people in their communities. And I am relatively optimistic that of all of the new leaders, and there seems to be a new generation of leadership emerging throughout Latin America, willing to try different things, willing to try different policies, willing to talk in ways that we've not seen before about hope and expectations to live in a society without corruption gripping every part of public policy. And that gives me some optimism that there's a lot of good things to see, a lot of good things to look forward to coming out of this part of the world. I hope that I'm right about that, but my warning of the challenges to come is paired with hope that there are leaders emerging in a new generation in Latin America that will allow that part of the world to thrive and grow and potentially to fill in leadership gaps that we see emerging around the world as some of the major powers, potentially including the United States, take a step back in global leadership. Now, speaking of all of this, part two of this interview with Fulton will move on to this topic of foreign policy from Latin America's perspective, their place in the world, how they're thinking about conflicts all over the planet, including the Middle East, how they're thinking about international relations with countries that are rivals to the United States, countries like Russia, Iran, China, and others. And we'll also touch on where we think the trends of the region are going. Fulton is an expert, after all, in this part of the world. Who better to ask about what he's keeping an eye on that we should all be keeping an eye on? So that's part two. That's our next episode. If you are not already a subscriber, please subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're accessing this program from. Or if you're not a podcaster, are not podcast listener routinely and you're finding us on YouTube, just subscribe to my YouTube channel, Brian J. Matos Podcast. That's the channel. Full episodes are available on YouTube. Preview clips are available there for you to listen to, share with your friends. I'm also available on all of the social media sites. And if you don't know where else to find me, all my episodes and show notes and some exclusive stuff is available on my website, brianjmatos.com. You can find all of my episodes, all my archived episodes there as well, and links to subscriptions on any of your favorite podcast platforms. So until our next part two interview episode, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.